Well, thank you, Joyce and Michelle, for having me. It's an honor. And thank you all for your time. I know that's so valuable. And so just a little bit about me, but let's get to the training. But I have been a special education advocate for 26 years. I was not planning on doing that. I was planning on being popular, but that's not how it worked out. I had a child with a disability, and when I came into the system with a 3-year-old, I found it to be hard to navigate, hard to negotiate, and really overwhelming. I think it's important that we remember our parents are in trauma, and we go into a school setting where we have these very educated, informed professionals who are speaking another language, right? And so my job as a special education advocate and the affiliates that I train nationally is an advocate's job is to bridge parent passion with educator wisdom to craft and create a document that appropriately serves a student for successful student outcomes. And that's my one goal. And my mission statement is really my truth, that when we get it right for the child, we get it right for everybody. And we do that all the time. And so kind of going through the slides, the 5 pillars of the IEP, I think it's important that we have sort of a template to go on so that we know sort of a framework. And I know that, an IEP could be 16 pages long. I just had one that was 79 pages long. So kind of what is the skeleton we're looking for? And I believe if you know these 5 pillars, it's going to give you a really robust starting place so that we can properly serve kids with identified special education needs. So on the next slide, it says Special Education Academy. So we train nationally and people internationally for everyone who sits at the IEP table. We train everyone who sits at the IEP table because we are all advocates for that child with an identified disability. And so whether you're a diagnostician, an LSSP, a social worker, an assistant principal, whoever you are at the table serving a student with a disability, we should have all the same goal and the same focus, and that is simply for successful student outcomes. And so when we do that, we get it right for kiddos. And so let's look at the next slide. And this is really for, it's for a parent, or it's for a teacher or somebody at church or the neighbor or a relative. And really that first question is, when did you notice something was different? And as parents or guardians, a lot of us do notice something different quickly. And we have lovely friends and people that speak into our life and tell us why, oh, it's no big deal. It's going to be fine. My son was slow. My daughter was slow like this. And while that might be completely accurate, what I would tell you is when you know something is different, that you act on it, right? Because there's no better thing we can do for our kiddos with differences, however they are, emotionally, medically, academically, and to intervene. And so on the next slide, it says, how do we respond to the need? So talking about, an educational consideration, there are services and provisions for students in education that start before the kindergarten years, right? And so how we respond to the need, if we believe our child has a possible disability, they have a difference, right? They have a difference in cognition, they have a difference functionally, they have a difference emotionally, they respond differently. Is it we go about getting them tested to identify disability. And so on the next slide, it talks about getting your child tested to identify disability. And for me, how I started my career in special education is I had a son that was nonverbal. And so somebody told me at my job that in Texas, because I live in the great state of Texas, that if your child is speech delayed, you can start school at 3. And I thought that is fantastic. I'm going to get him tested and send him to school where they know everything. People at the school know everything. You just send them across the street and with their Lion King backpack, and they're going to work everything out. And so I started the process of getting my child tested to identify disability. And usually when they're littles, I call them littles, when they're between 2.5 and 3, you take them in for an assessment, an evaluation. When they're little, we do what we call an arena assessment. And that is a little more informal, but you have multidisciplinary team members, hopefully somebody from the language place, from emotional, behavioral, psychological, certainly diagnosticians, and any other related service providers that provide a product for your student. And they will tell you whether or not they meet eligibility for special education and related services. And so when we're looking at evaluation, you want to make sure that we remember, as it goes on the next slide, that the F stands for full. Wonderful, amazing Dr. Michael Webb, who teaches at Sam Houston State University, teaches diagnosticians. He says, don't ever forget that the F stands for full, in a full and individualized evaluation. And I think that one of the greatest concerns that I see as I serve parents from coast to coast, is that I will get their opening packet and their opening documents, and they have a full FIIE, a full initial individualized evaluation, and it's tiny. And as you can tell by my hairdo, I don't like tiny. I like full and puffy. And the reason we want it to be full is it's a requirement for initial, and that testing does one of two things. If you're taking notes, please write this down. Testing does one of two things. It identifies or eliminates, and I need both. And when we don't have a component in that initial full and individualized evaluation, there's a high probability that we're going to miss a student's need and not intervene correctly. So when you're looking at a full and individualized evaluation, what does that mean, Karen? That means that you're going to have to do all 8 areas. I'm going to give you the 8 areas. And number one, I'm going to ask for a speech and language evaluation to include pragmatic. Really important that you say it like that. Speech and language evaluation to include pragmatics. Often, evaluators would not do that pragmatic piece unless there was a consideration or a need for looking at the area of autism. However, you can have a need in the area of pragmatic as it relates to language without having the eligibility of autism. Number two, we're going to look at medical physical, right? What's going on with this kiddo? Does he have physical needs? Does he have a sensory disability? Has a vision impairment? Is he deaf blind? Is he deaf and hard of hearing? And medical needs. Are there medical concerns that impact the student? Are there allergies? Are there known identified eligibilities that what maybe be under the DSM-5 criteria? Are there things that are medical diagnoses that we know about? Are there medical diagnoses that we take medicines for? Any of those protocols that would fall under medical physical. Number three, sociological. And I think, in this era of online and post-COVID, I think that we're now really starting to get a bigger glimpse of the impact of these sociological settings. And so I have a myriad of clients that have a different, family setups, whether it's guardians or 2 parents or parents that are single or parents that are divorced and remarried, whatever that combination is. All of those things are things that are important that we note and take information on because they impact a child in ways that we might not be able to see visually, right? So let's say a child has lost a pet. While that may not seem like that big of a deal for adults, it very much can impact a student. We had a little rainstorm here in Houston a few years ago called Harvey, and there were tons of children that were emergency evacuated from second stories of their house who are still impacted by that and still talk about it. They get fearful when it rains. And so maybe the last sibling besides this student has moved off to college. Maybe grandma's moved in. Maybe dad doesn't go to work anymore because dad works from home, and all that impacts a child. And we want to be able to make sure that we've captured that, identified that, and really looked into that. Okay? So number one, speech and language evaluation to include pragmatic. Number two, medical physical. Number three, sociological. Okay? Number four is going to be IQ or cognition. And so IQ or cognition are simply brain skills. I know we get very excited about a high IQ. We want to know how you're cooked, right? And so your IQ tells you about these brain skills, these processes, and whether or not they rise to the level of identifying an eligibility. They're certainly going to give me, as the educator, the parent, the tutor, any of the support team, information about the best way to deliver their educational product. So I'm going to ask for a test, an IQ test in all 7 Gs, in all 7 Gs. Some diagnosticians would say 8 Gs if we separate long-term memory and long-term storage and long-term retrieval. I want all 7 Gs so that I don't miss anything. Again, it's very easy to miss something because we think that we know what the eligibility is, right? Number 5, I'm going to ask for formal achievement. I'm going to ask for formal achievement. In that formal achievement, which is usually reading, math, and writing, I'm additionally going to ask for consideration for OE, oral expression, and LC, listening comprehension. So those, there's 9 specific learning disabilities. And so I want to make sure that I've teased out the ability to identify all of those. And so that would be number 5, formal achievement. And add oral expression and listening comprehension. Number 6, I'm going to ask for formal adaptive behavior. And again, remember, we're talking about this as initial. Formal adaptive behavior. How much am I like my peers? How much am I like other 57-year-olds? And what does that look like in different settings, right? Home, leisure, school, communicative, all sorts of areas to see if there's a deficit or your adaptive behavior is commensurate with your cognition. And so number 6, formal adaptive behavior. Number 7, which I think is so important and probably is the thing that I see missing almost always. So all of you grown-ups that work at schools, please lean into this. Let's not say to parents when we're talking about emotional, behavioral, or psychological, has your son been sent to the office, right? So whether or not you were sent to the office doesn't determine whether or not I need special education and related services. Otherwise, I would have had an IEP growing up. I think I invented the office. I know I invented the color change. And I know that we have a good intention when we say that to parents. But remember, as multidisciplinary team members and school-based members, you've been given the gift of what? Persuasion. So I want you to be very responsible with those words that you use with lay people that are parents and guardians. And so we all have emotions and behaviors, and we're looking to see if those emotions, those behaviors impact that student's learning and or the learning of others. So I love a good, robust psychological evaluation, or depending where you are in the United States, social, emotional. And what are some of the things that I could get out of a formal assessment for that? I'm going to ask for formal teacher interview, at least 2 teachers, not rating scales, although I do love a rating scale. I want one of the multidisciplinary team members to speak to the teachers, because I see that the rating scales that we send out often, which I'm sure are norm and standardized, sometimes pigeonhole a child because they're checklists, right? Always, sometimes, never. Always, sometimes, never, right? I want both parents, if there are 2 parents, if there's 4 parents, for them to fill out rating scales in an interview. If it's appropriate, I want that student to have an interview. I love kids. Kids slay me. They crack me up. They will tell you what's going on if you talk to them. It's amazing. And we need to listen to their input, right? In that emotional behavioral space, we are looking at 3 eligibilities as it relates to IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We're looking at autism, looking at emotional disturbance, and we're looking at ADHD, any of those 3 types, inattentive, hyperactivity, combined type. Okay. I might ask for counseling as a related service in this section. I might ask for an FBA, a functional behavioral assessment that may give birth to a behavior intervention plan. I might ask for psych services, which any student at any time in public school can have psych services, whether they're general ed, 504, or special education. So there's a lot of things that I can get and draw from in that emotional behavioral evaluation or psychological evaluation, depending on where you are in the United States. So that's going to be number 7. And then number 8, which is so important. It's so important for all my evaluators on here, related services, right? Because what does Child Find charge the LEA with? The local education agency has a responsibility to ILE. The school has a responsibility to ILE, identify, locate, and evaluate children with suspected disabilities. And we've added on to that, right? We've added on to the formal law and said, well, unless they have good grades. Well, unless we have this. And the law is very linear. It doesn't say all that. It says suspected disabilities to see if they are in need of special education and related services. So let's be thorough when we're doing this evaluation and consider related services. And I won't give you an exhaustive list because it could be everything from a braille, it could be orientation mobility, but some pretty common ones that I'm going to ask for most kiddos are occupational therapy and fine motor, occupational therapy and sensory, assistive technology and communication, assistive technology and written expression, music therapy, physical therapy, parent training and counseling. Parents are legally allowed to have parent training and counseling as it relates to having a child with identified disability, in-home training, parent training. The list is pretty long of related services a student could have to benefit from their education. So I'm going to run through them again real quickly. So number 1, speech and language evaluation to include pragmatic. Number 2, medical physical. Number 3, sociological. Number 4, formal IQ testing to include all 7 Gs. Number 5, formal achievement, reading, writing, and math to include um, listening comprehension and oral expression. Number 6, formal adaptive behavior. Number 7, psychological or emotional behavior. And then number 8, related services. Okay, so these are supposed to be on the initial evaluation. Okay, so let's look at the next slide. So what we're going to do, just one slide. Yeah. So what we're going to do on this slide when we come back with the evaluations is we're going to do what? We're going to identify the impact of your child's disability. We need to identify the impact of your child's disability. And so once we've completed those evaluations, only one of 3 options are going to come into play. And so on the next slide, you'll see option number 1 or outcome number 1, right? After the evaluations have been completed, and it takes a while to complete them, which is why I tell parents, I don't know what you're waiting for. And it's why I tell schools and I do professional development. And actually, we're not waiting for anything. We're not waiting for RTI. We're not waiting for MTSS. There's an amazing little letter from OSEP, the Office of Special Education Programs, January 11th, 2011, which says RTI nor MTSS is a replacement for special education testing if there's a suspected disability. And I know that some people have been taught by their school-based members that we cannot do an evaluation until there's RTI, and that's not what the federal law says. We need to remember that if a parent requests an evaluation and there's reason to do that evaluation, that we go ahead and start that process. While we can certainly do RTI or MTSS or 504, that doesn't stop the start of special education testing. So the special education testing, depending on where you are in the United States, can be up to 60 school days. 60 school days. That's a very long time. In Texas, it's 45 school days. So what is that? That's 9 weeks. That's 25% of the school year. That's a lot of time, right? And then we have 30 calendar days to come back to the table after we have the evaluations. So be very responsible when we're telling parents, give us another grading period. Let's do this. That's just boys. They don't like to read. Girls don't like to write. Let's not make those overstatements. But if there's a need for special education related services, that we do the testing to find out one of these 3 outcomes. So outcome number 1 after the completion of the testing will be that your child does not have a disability that needs additional support at school. So what does that mean? We've finished the testing in totality, and we believe that the general education teacher with her Superman cape on is sufficient to provide your student an educational benefit, right? Let's look at the next slide. When we get the test back, we might have outcome number 2. Your child does, in fact, have a disability that needs additional support at school called a 504. So let's identify what a 504 is. So a 504 is a civil rights law, and it was never intended to have more kids on a 504, I believe, than an IEP. It was a civil right, and it simply said that you could not be denied accommodations based on your identified disability. And so there is no teaching in a 504. There's no tracking. There are probably less than, on one hand, I could count in this over 25 years of serving kiddos in special ed, that I believed a 504 was sufficient. What can I have on a 504, Karen? You could have the accommodations. You could have general ed dyslexia. You could have an IHP, an individualized healthcare plan, which anybody in the building could have. And you could have sort of a light behavior program. But most 504s that I receive, they turn out to be good teaching. So again, both of these, outcome number 2 and number 3, has to have an identified disability. So do you have a disability that rises to the level of I need accommodations that the teacher wouldn't do anyway and doesn't do for the rest of the class? Okay. And then number 3 is sort of the totality we're talking about today, is outcome number 3. Your child does have a disability that needs additional support at school that we called an IEP, an individualized education program. Okay. And so, what is an individualized education program? Where did it come from? So for brevity, looking at the next slide, just really quickly, in 1975, President Gerald Ford signed into the Educating All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. It was the first time that many children were even allowed on campuses and in classrooms in public schools. And then in 1990, it turned into IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And out of that, we are charged with writing a document, an individual education program that now the charge is, since Andrew F. March 17th, 2017, is that the school has a responsibility and a duty to reasonably calculate the student's disability and to write an IEP that enables them to make progress appropriate in light of their unique circumstances. And so it's a task. It's not a quick task. It's not something we just populate really quickly. We're supposed to take this task quite serious. So developing a complete individualized program, an IEP, I believe if you understand these first 5 pillars, and certainly they're not exhaustive, but at minimum, these 5 pillars will exist in every IEP that you ever write. Okay, so let's look at pillar number 1. And pillar number 1, without exception or exemption, is the most important, and we really have to work on doing it better. So present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, a PLAP. And so in different parts of the country, it's called a PLOP. But what that means is it's the beginning part of the IEP. It's a very descriptive narrative identifying the student with their disability, their comorbidities, and as the language says in the federal law, their unique circumstances. So we're not building a product off of your disability. We're not building a product off of your disabilities. We're building an IEP off of your unique circumstances. And so for me, when I'm training schools or I'm training affiliates or advocates, how does the student's disability impact them across settings? And I mean literally across settings. So bell to bell, and for some kids, bus to bus, right? I should be able to pick up your present levels of any child, whether they're in Miami, Massachusetts, San Diego, or on an island in Alaska, and stand there with your present levels at the back of the class and go, oh, this is Billy. I can see who you're talking about. And if when you pick up that present level and you're reading about a content area or subject area, and you can't see that child in that setting, you are not finished. You're not finished. You need to go back and add more language, more descriptors, and talk about the acuity of their disability and how that shows up. A lot of times when I get present levels, there's lots of information that don't really mean a lot to me. Billy has an 85 in history. That doesn't mean a lot to me as I'm writing an IEP. And we know that grades are very subjective. And when I went to school 100 years ago on a covered wagon, we got a grade, and that was the grade that we got. And so now there is tremendous pressure from school districts on teachers to make sure that our kids pass. And so a lot of times I see grades which may not be indicative of the student's true output, right? 2 things happen in a class: instruction and production. I really want to know what the kid's production looks like. And I can't always quantify that based on quote unquote good grades. Probably in the last 6-7 years, and I do about 500 IEPs a year, besides federal filings and state complaints and due process hearings and mediations. I don't know that I've had a child in the last 6 or 7 years that has a failing grade. I don't know that teachers are allowed for that to happen anymore. So I don't really give a lot of weight anymore to their academic grade. What I do give a lot of weight to in the present levels is, what are their communicative needs? What are their social emotional needs? What are their functional needs? What are their academic needs? See, the language in IDEA doesn't talk about an academic need. So please be very careful with parents when you're saying, oh, he's got good grades, no need for an IEP. The language says, is there an educational need? I have lots of kiddos with neurological differences that are exceptional. Some of them are twice exceptional, and they still need an individualized education program. Okay? So it's important that we know that. So the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. So for purposes of today, let's say that said kiddo's in 7th grade. That means they have 7 teachers. So if he has a specific learning disability in reading and a speech impairment, I don't want to just hear from reading and the speech therapist. I want to hear from everybody that provides him an educational product. All that information is purposeful as I develop an individualized education program. If they're little, I want to know what's going on in the hall, what's going on at recess, what's going on in your electives or your ancillary classes. How's lunch going? How's the car rider line going? All of that information drives whether I'm doing more testing or consideration of more appropriate educational goals. So that's the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. When I'm training people, this pillar needs to have the 3 Ps, and they are puffy, pristine, and prescriptive. If your present levels are not those 3 things, you've got to go back and do them again. I would also say that your present levels should be about 50% of your IEP meeting, because everything good and right in that document is going to happen in the present levels, and that will give way to our directives in the other areas. So number 2, annual goals. Number 2, annual goals. And notice it doesn't say academic goals, right? There are lots of IEPs that do not have a single academic goal. You don't have to have an academic deficit to have an IEP. So what could those annual goals be? They could be academic, they could be behavioral, they could be functional. What's a functional goal? Do I stay dressed? Do I say, do I have trouble donning my clothes, just putting them on, or doffing, taking them off? Do I need help eating? Do I need help buttoning? Do I need other sorts of help? Emotional goals, social goals, communicative, related service, ESY. They could be a draft goal. They could be any of those things. So it's really important that we're writing annual goals that we identify every single deficit. And so for the 3 Ps for the PLAF, it's puffy, pristine, and prescriptive. Puffy, pristine, and prescriptive. Okay. So annual goals are any identified deficit. Of course, if you have an eligibility, it must have at least one annual goal around it, right? So let's say the student has autism and a speech impairment. I have to have at least one goal that relates to the impact of his autism. I have to have at least one annual goal that relates to his speech impairment. However, let's say that we have data that says he struggles in reading, then I additionally can have a reading goal, but make sure at minimum that you have at least one goal around each identified eligibility. Okay. All right. So number 3, pillar number 3, needed accommodations. Notice it doesn't say every accommodation that you could think of. So I do a lot of filings with the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, and I file that people's civil rights have been violated. And so when I file that, I'm filing that their accommodations weren't implemented, whether it's in an IEP or whether it's in a 504. So everyone listening must know that an accommodation is a civil right. Everyone listening, brace yourself, has to track daily accommodations. I know I didn't make it up, not my role, right? And so why do we track them? We track them like any good teacher would track them, or service provider, to know about their efficacy, right? Is this working? Is it needed? So when I get an IEP and it has 42 accommodations, I'm like, oh, no, 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 no. Miss Smith does not stand up at the beginning of class and list 42 accommodations and then say, good morning. So I want you to go back to your accommodations and I want you to prune them. An accommodation, we agreed as a committee, without these accommodations, the student will not be successful on their IEP. That's the only reason we have it. Not, well, just in case, I'm worried, Karen, what if? None of those things are how we get accommodations. We do not educate based on fear. We only educate based on facts. And there is only one fact in education, and that's called data. And if I can't chart it, it's not data. It is feelings. And I understand feelings, but feelings have no intellect and they are not facts. And so we write needed accommodations as needed so that the student can make meaningful progress on their individualized education program. As a recommendation, I would never recommend to anybody building an IEP or an advocate or school-based members to have more than 9 or 10 accommodations. I don't believe you need more than that to implement IEP goals or to implement a good 504. If you have more than that many accommodations on a 504, it should be an IEP. And if you have more accommodations than that in the IEP, I think that you probably need to look at adjustment of how we serve that student in supports, supplementary aids, and special education time. Okay. Pillar number 4. Pillar number 4, where to implement the student's program. So LRE is not general ed. I know, I can't believe I just said that. LRE is not general ed. LRE is a consideration. And the consideration as a committee is that we have a charge, right? We have a charge to educate students to the maximum extent possible with disabilities with their non-disabled peers with strategies and supports and supplementary aids to the maximum extent possible. And sometimes that's not possible or appropriate. So the LRE is the place where we can maximize the students' education, right? And if that is in general ed, fantastic. That is in special ed, fantastic. If that's in a self-contained setting, fantastic. If that's in an out-of-district day placement, fantastic. If that's in a psychiatric unit, fantastic. But we have to stop saying LRE is general education. It's not. LRE is not a location, it's a consideration, right? And special education is not a location, it's a service. So during the LRE, we're talking about it and we're looking at the acuity of the disability. We're talking about things that have been provided, considered, tried, and where to best maximize the student's program. It should always be moving. It should not always be the same. So where is the best place to implement, to work on, and to deliver the student's individualized education program? Okay. And then pillar number 5, the students required special education support time. And words are everything. Words are everything. The students required special education support time. The SOS page, Save Our Student page, the schedule of services. What is required as it relates to special education to support this student to have a benefit from their individualized education program? And depending on what you are in the United States and what software you use, some schools, districts, counties, or states put every part of their schedule on there, but at minimum, you have to put their special education support minutes on there. So what is required for the student to benefit from their individualized education plan? What's required in math, in English, in language arts, science, and social studies, in their elective classes, in their ancillary classes, and their career and technology classes. So those things need to be documented. Is it general ed or special ed dyslexia? Do you have related services? Are they direct? Are they consult? Are they integrated? Does the parent have any idea what that means, right? And how do you determine those numbers? You determine those numbers because you wrote a PLAF that was puffy, pristine, and prescriptive. And they described the student's disability and the impact of them and his or her unique circumstances. And based on that, we started looking at special education support time minutes. So sort of as a standard for me, and of course it's not perfection, it's just sort of a standard for me. If I have a child in a general ed class, let's say the general ed class is 60 minutes, and I believe that that student needs in-class support, then I would start out with a third of that time. I would say 20 minutes, right? I don't need somebody on their hip. I don't need somebody on their hip. And I know parents, a lot of parents want and believe that they need a one-on-one aid, a one-on-one shadow. And unfortunately, what that does, in my opinion, is it skews the data, right? And there certainly are exceptions to that. There certainly are students that require a support person for a number of reasons, whether they're medical, whether they're safety, all sorts of things. But really, I want to painstakingly look at this place in the document and say, what does she need in English? And we want to make sure that it's not all the same, right? That we get 20 minutes in English and we get 20 minutes in math, and it's amazing how they get exactly the same thing, but you have a conversation in the present levels and talk to each of those teachers, or at least they send in a summary email to the case manager and say, what does that autism look like when she's in math? What does that autism look like when she's in science? What does her autism look like when she's in social studies? It shouldn't be the same because they're humans and it shows up differently. And then based on those areas, we determine as a committee what's the appropriate starting place of support. Okay. And then next slide, and which is so important, partnering with the school for appropriate implementation of FAPE. And what is FAPE? It's so easy to define. FAPE is a free, appropriate public education. Sort of like how long is a string and how many colors of blue are there. FAPE is going to look different depending on which district appellate court you're in. I'm in the Fifth Circuit Court. FAPE in Texas might look a little bit different than it looks in Connecticut. And so That's going to be known and sort of litigated based upon state and federal cases that are heard by hearing officers and appellate judges. But it should mean the ability for the student to be enabled to make progress appropriate, unique, in light of their unique circumstances. And so our job, and my job as an advocate, is to help people partner. It's my experience that most people really do want the same thing, that they struggle with language, they struggle with communication when they get to an IEP table. And it can feel adversarial. It can feel like from teachers, parents are saying, I'm not doing a good job. And it can feel like for parents, school's not listening to my position. And so, one of a great case was heard and it said, we have to allow the parents to fully air their concerns. We have to allow parents to fully air their concerns. And as an advocate that's represented thousands of people over the years, whether that's in an IEP meeting, in a meeting with a superintendent, in a mediation, in a dispute resolution session, a grievance, a federal complaint, you just let the parents finish airing their concerns. Most of the problems can be worked out there. We want to keep decisions and problems negotiated at the IEP table. Can they always be done there? No. But I think that if we allow them the same grace and honor parents as we do to everybody, and that we understand that we are all weighted equally at the IEP table, we are all equal stakeholders. Parents are 50% stakeholders, and the schools are 50% stakeholders. And I am not a teacher. God bless teachers. I can understand how it feels like sometimes you believe that you know best. But the truth is, case law and federal law will say that the parent is the expert, right? That's what the case law says, and they are, right? And while they may have never taught a child in school, they are the expert as it relates to students. So, one of the things that I recommend when I do professional development is that schools do a much better job of partnering with parents, right? As somebody that had child in special education for 16 years, nobody ever asked for my input outside of an IEP meeting. Nobody ever called me ahead of time and said, hey, we're going to have your son's IEP meeting. Just wanted to see what's going on at home. Any changes at home? Did you get a new puppy? Is there a baby on the way? Are you moving? Was there a job change? And I understand that school-based members are overloaded and overworked and underpaid. But it would make these business meetings called IEP meetings so much more efficient if we just did a little bit of time on the front end before we got to a meeting. The other part of partnering is just that. So before I go into an IEP meeting with school-based members, I ask for a full draft copy of the IEP to include these 5 components. Not because I'm going to aha you or I'm going to say it's predetermination, so that I can prepare. I don't want to go into a meeting and I'm not been given the ability to prepare my client and give them some parameters around what can be the expectation or the outcomes of an IEP meeting. And so I think if schools rethought sharing a full draft copy of the IEP document, knowing that it's just a draft and all decisions are made in the meeting, I think that you would find that's a much better business model. Okay. And then next, it's going to be time to reassess your child. All right. So we have a legal requirement at maximum every 3 years that we consider reassessing the child. And we go through those 8 areas again. Do you have to reassess in all areas? You do not. But we consider those areas that need to be reassessed for updated levels, looking at a new eligibility, or to see if in fact they are still in need of special education and related services. And so on the next slide, it really is my heart. When we get it right for the child, we get it right for everyone. And that would be everyone at the IEP table. And what I tell new teachers or new advocates when they say, what's your best advice? I have a meeting tomorrow. Keep it student focused. We all have very clear positions and commitments and beliefs. But you want to remember that it's about the student. Okay. Next, my next slide, which is what I tell everybody and everybody that I train, we are in the service business. If you're in the education business, you're in the service business. If you're an advocate, you're in the service business. And so please let us know if there's any way that we can serve you. The email is there. We provide in-person and virtual learning to school districts nationally. all obviously any sorts of groups of people. And then we have a team of advocates that represent families, and we train people to be professional advocates, however they sit at the IEP table. And so the next few pages are just my information. If you would like to follow me on the social media, I don't know if that's what they call it, the social media, the TikTok, the YouTube, all of the things, we are there providing education lives so that you guys can have the information that you need. Because really our heart is to answer your questions so that kids can get successful student outcomes and they can be delivered what's promised federally, right? Gainful employment, independent living, and further education. So thank you so much for this time. We'd love to open it up for some questions if you guys have any.
Oh my goodness. Karen, I've got pages of notes and I've been in special ed for years.
Yes,
Like I
and
said,
there were some great questions. So thank you guys. Thank you, Karen, so much. That was fabulous.
really fabulous. And it's core information that everybody really does need to know and that we forget about sometimes because we get into our own routine. So Michelle, you want to start us off? Do you have questions that you'd like to start with?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the first one, and I'm just going to kind of go down through everything that I heard. So the first one said, I read that saying students with special needs is not favored. Is that the truth?
Saying students with special needs is not favored. So
Yes.
I don't know if it's favored or not favored. We identify children with eligibilities, and those are disability categories. Children don't have labels, packages do, and the eligibility opens the door for services and supports.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, the next one. Can you add more clarification around puffy when talking about the 3 Ps?
Yeah, like my hairdo, big, huge, Texas. We should all, when you read a novel and you see a movie, when I read your plaf, I should see Billy. I should see Billy at 8 a.m. and I should see Billy when he gets on the bus. If you don't, you're not finished.
Okay, great. Another one. I just got out of my IEP meeting for my son. I would like to talk to somebody about it. I am in Ohio. Is there somebody I can contact?
Absolutely. We have a team of advocates. Just email us at admin@specialeducationacademy.com.
Perfect. And then Joyce, did you have any more? I have like a bunch of different ones, but I want to make sure that we're kind of going back and forth and not missing anybody.
Well, I'm just going to reiterate something we wrote in the chat a lot, and that was that we're going to be sharing this video. It'll be up on our site. Everybody who registered also gets an email of that. But really just wonderful kind of walkthrough. I think the one question that I saw that was really could bear some repeating is in the 504 versus an IEP. When it comes to accommodations, you said if there's so many accommodations in a 504, it should be an IEP. Is there balance? Is there guidance that you can offer on that?
It's just Karen guidance, so it's not real, but it's real. So again, what happens is we give general ed teachers 500 accommodations, and what they're doing really is they're special editing a kiddo, which is not fair to that kiddo or the other children, right? And so really a 504, don't recommend that a child with an identified disability that we give a 504. Even my kiddos that have diabetes, we're looking at, is there an educational need? Do they need special education? Do they need SDI, specially designed instruction? Do they need somebody to instruct them in a specialty area? And almost always it's yes. Even our kids with diabetes, I need to teach them to go to the nurse, get your Dexcom checked, snack if you need to, dose if you need to, check your levels when you test. Again, we do one thing in special ed, just one. We're teaching a child with a disability to self-manage that disability for a lifetime. I don't find that a 504 does that.
It's awesome. Really good. I think, Michelle, you covered some of the other ones that I was picking up on, but I really love 2 things I just think need repeating, and that's ask for the draft of that IEP, draft of the IEP. Let people know that it's a draft. We get it. And ask for that prior to the meeting so you could prepare. I think a kind and polite request should be honored on that. I think that's super important. I've seen people miss that and they walk in, they get blindsided.
And so Joyce, let me just give you I've got a great email that I say, dear staff, please provide us a full draft copy of the IEP document, understanding it's just a draft and that all decisions are only made in the meeting. Without that draft ahead of time, it's unlikely that my client will be able to make an informed decision and will have to reschedule.
Yeah, that's lovely. We're getting in some more questions now that a couple may be just more personal. So, in specific case and so forth, I think it might be, I'm going to give it a shot because I think we need to be fair here. So I'm going to give these couple and then we'll stop. So this is: my child was denied an initial evaluation after being in an intervention from K through 2. No 504 or IEP. We paid for testing and have a diagnosis, and we're now requesting an IEP for this. What advice do you have? The school has not cooperated and supplied appropriate information. And for example, they moved her from Title I services without a meeting. That's kind of, you need some advice
Yeah,
from
so
somebody like me.
yeah, and so just so for context, data drives everything. If your child was in intervention for 3 years, that's the data that supports it. The law is really clean. We've added to it. It's really clean. Do you have a child with suspected disabilities? If you do, you test them. That's it. Additionally, that school was required legally to provide you a robust prior written notice. And so it's important that those components are in place. I understand a lot of you guys have specific questions to things. And because you're on this webinar, if you email us, we will provide you a free month membership to Special Education Academy, which has hundreds of hours of archived live webinars and workbooks. We go live every Tuesday at the Academy. Additionally, we go live every Tuesday at 7 on TikTok. And we just have an hour of rapid fire questions that we have my moderators tell me the questions. So we want to answer your questions. We want to equip you. But absolutely, these are all important questions.
Awesome. I'm just looking at the time, and I guess I'm just going to ask one more, and that is, how can I help tracking data and help Gen Ed track the data? There's so much data and so little time. It was a great statement. Had to share.
So in every software used in the United States, they will print you out blank data collection sheets for the child's IEP goals, and they will print you out blank accommodation sheets. So it's a simple checklist, right? And whoever is the implementer on the IEP goal, general ed, special education related, or instructional service provider, has the onus and responsibility, the duty to implement and track data. So, sometimes I'm in due process hearings and the general ed teacher would say, oh, well, he's got somebody with him. So the reason that we have general ed and special ed implement the goal is so that together we can decide if it's effectual and if we need to make adjustments.
Yeah. And it really is a kind of a culture around that. When you all begin looking at the data together and you get those little aha moments together, then you realize, oh, this was really good. I didn't realize it gained that much. When you get those little gains and you realize it's all working, then you say, oh, okay, so it's not just work.
Right.
It's hard because there's not enough hours in the day. And especially what we've all been through for the past few years.
Sure, absolutely.
Time is here. So we'll try and get any other questions that were not answered over to Karen. And you had the contact information. It's still up here now. Just want to say thank you so much, Karen.
Absolutely.
Yes,
really,
thank you.
Really informative. And just, like I said, I've been in education and special education for a million years. And what'd you say, since covered wagon times?
Yes, I went to school in a covered wagon.
Me too. I went, uphill both ways, kind of a thing. So I really, really appreciate you. And for everybody who spent their time here, we had so many folks here. We want to let you know there are many more resources for you here on our website. In fact, the website's been updated, so some of my pictures may not match exactly, but that resources button is there, and you can go and find a whole bunch of information, including the previous webinar Wednesdays, including this one will be added there. And all the other ones that we've done since 2020. So you can go back and look at them. The one we did in December kind of did a recap of everything from 2022. We also invite you on our website to sign up for our newsletter. It is free and it does not try and sell you anything, nor do we sell your name or use your personal information, but we do recap. Michelle does it. She does a marvelous job of recapping some of the high points on these conversations. And so you can share that newsletter with your colleagues and everybody and parents, everybody who's on an IEP meeting. We've got info packets. You can go ahead and take a look at it. We've got information on funding. So if you need any help in figuring out how that can help you, it's on our site under resources and so forth. I believe it's still all there. And most importantly, if you want to talk with us further, we do personalized Zoom meetings just to give you product overviews, answer your questions, and help you out with so many more things. So please reach out. Our contact information, especially Michelle's, for any further information on Education Associate materials is right up here. And we thank everybody here today for your time, your energy, and we wish you the very, very best for February. It's February, holy cow. And for the rest of this winter and spring. Thank you, Karen, once again, and thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys, so much. Have a good day. Thank you for joining us.
Alrighty, take care.
Bye.